The Australian economy has been completely destroyed within 4 weeks. Part 2. Martin North, John Adams. In the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
How are you going?
Well, thing is, we have another week under, tyranny, in my view. I'd really like my civil rights to be back. I'd like to get back to normal, but I'm only just a sole voice in the wilderness, and we have an almighty government dictating how we live our lives these days.
It does seem a bit like that, and I guess we should explain that as a result of that you are on audio once again, but from a remote location, but nevertheless we can still have our normal conversation. And there are some very important conversation points to be made, I think, because the quantum of the stimulus and the direction of the stimulus is frankly pretty shocking.
Absolutely. So, yes, so just to explain to our viewers, Martin, in last week's show, we talked about the decision to lock down or not to lock down as a result of the coronavirus. And that was part 1. So part 2 is we talk about the stimulus. Now, why are we talking about the stimulus? Because the stimulus, so the real story of this whole coronavirus issue is the stimulus. And the reason why they've rolled out this record amount of stimulus, they argue, is because of the lockdown, and the reason for the lockdown was because of the virus. So that's why we talk about the lockdown in part 1. We're going to talk about the stimulus in terms of part 2, and that's today's conversation. So to be honest, I'm very upset, Martin, in terms of the stimulus. There are some short-term impacts on the stimulus, and there are some long-term impacts, and I think most Australians don't understand those long-term impacts, and I think those impacts are going to be quite irreversible, and we'll get into the reasons why I believe that. But before we get into this, I just want to explain to our viewers, because sometimes people ask me, and I get correspondence all the time, why am I doing what I'm doing in terms of the show with you and some of the other activities that I've been doing over the last few years. And for me personally, what drove me to say, hey, I need to actually speak up starting in 2016 was actually I've got 2 children now, but I only had 1 daughter back then. And one of the main things that that drove my thinking in 2016 was, my daughter was 2 at the time, and now she's about to turn 6. And so I thought to myself, well, when she turns 18, what sort of Australia will she inherit? And will she actually have a better Australia than what I had when I turned 18, or will it be worse? And so I having worked in Parliament and knowing how incompetent some of these politicians are, I personally didn't trust the politicians to actually govern the country. And I had quite a few people say, well, who is it? Why is it your role to actually warn people about this economic crisis? Why don't you leave it up to the politicians? And I said, well, I used to work with them, and I know how bad they are. So I can't trust them there. So, one of the reasons why I'm very upset with this whole stimulus package that has happened is that we've basically stuffed at least 1 or 2 generations of Australians going forward, and that includes my kids. And I think if any of our viewers have children or even grandchildren, they should be concerned about where we go from here, because before the virus, we had a household debt bubble and we had a foreign debt bubble, and now we have a household debt bubble, a foreign debt bubble, and we have a dollar that's lost some significant value already, and I think that value will deteriorate going forward. And we have governments, both federal and state and territory, that are now drowning in debt. So we actually haven't fixed anything. We've actually compounded our problems, and that's happened within 6 weeks.
Yeah, and I think it's worth just saying, John, that you and I disagree on one point, which is whether the lockdown should have been executed the way it was or not. There was a poll that came out on Twitter, and I think I won by about 10 points. But we both have major issues about the quantum of debt in the system, and the fact that ultimately debt just doesn't go away. It sits there lurking and essentially is a dampener on future.
Yeah, true. Now we're not going to go into the specific measures about the stimulus in today's show, Martin. I mean, if anyone wants to, so in my essay that I published on my website, I went through all of the stimulus announcements for the first 4 weeks, starting from about the 12th of March. And so that captures the bulk of the announcements. There have been some subsequent announcements since then, and I'll probably do an update in the next few weeks about what the quantum of stimulus is. So if people want to know the specific stimulus measures, I would invite people to go to read my essay about that. But what I calculated is when you look at the monetary stimulus, when you look at the fiscal stimulus at the federal and state level, in the first 4 weeks, they announced about $417 billion of stimulus right across the country. I don't think that's going to be the end of it. I think there will be more stimulus going forward, and obviously it depends on how long the lockdown, how long that goes for. And I think there'll be some sort of stimulus around transitions back to an unlocked economy, and we'll talk about that soon. But I think the key question that our audience needs to ask themselves is, was the stimulus necessary, and the scale of the stimulus, was that necessary? And who was the beneficiary of the stimulus? I think these are the key questions that people need to ask themselves. And these are some of the questions that I initially asked myself when I saw events unfold in March, when we started to see these stimulus announcements being made. So the first point to make, Martin, is on the 11th of March, this is where Scott Morrison and Greg Hunt, the health minister, made an announcement at Parliament for a $2.4 billion package, which addressed the specific cost in relation to COVID-19. So this was about more testing, more resources for hospitals, providing the public with more information about what's really going on. And so there was an initial amount of cost that was allocated, or spending that was allocated to deal with the health crisis, and then everything else subsequent to the 11th of March had nothing to do with in terms of the direct health costs and additional funding for hospitals at the state level. But the bulk of the stimulus at the state level was, again, had nothing to do with it in terms of the health crisis. So when I think about this is, why did we have all this stimulus? If there was all this stimulus that had nothing to do with the health crisis, well, what was that about? And the reality is it was about the debt bubble. Because everyone was nervous that without this economic stimulus, the debt bubble that you and I have been talking about, it would have collapsed, and we would have gone into a huge depression. So, one of the questions I think our audience needs to ask themselves is, well, did we have record stimulus in 1918-19 when we had the Spanish flu? And was it a record stimulus package? And the answer was no. So this stimulus package that was rolled out is pretty much unprecedented in the course of Australian history, whether you look at an economic crisis or a pandemic. And obviously the quantum of stimulus that's been announced is larger than the Rudd government response in 2008. So in a previous show, Martin, we talked about the repo crisis, and we talked about how the repo market in New York cracked on the 17th of September 2019. And so it's been our position that prior to the coronavirus, the financial markets were in trouble. We were headed towards a crisis in any case. And so all that the coronavirus did was it brought the crisis timetable forward, and it made it go faster. So that's what I think people need to really understand about why did we spend $417 billion in 4 weeks when it had nothing to do directly with health costs to do with the virus. It was all about the debt bubble.
Yeah, and I think, John, I don't know whether you agree with me, but I think that the Australian government was reacting to the other central bank interventions, particularly, of course, the Fed. And I would argue that there's been a bit of coordinated activity across central banks to essentially support the system But when we say the system, we're talking about the financial system, as we called out earlier on. It was the repo issue back in September, which was the indicator of stress. And essentially what's happened is that most of the activity in most of the jurisdictions are to support the financial system and the financial plumbing, not necessarily directly to support households and businesses.
True. So yes, and on the issue of coordination, so we absolutely know there was coordination. I mean, if you recall, before the Reserve Bank made their big announcements about lowering interest rates and starting quantitative easing and doing these $100 billion repo operations in the Australian market, I mean, we had an announcement by the US Fed on Sunday night their time, Monday morning our time. Yep. Then New Zealand came out, and then we came out shortly after. So the central banks were obviously talking with each other, and I mean, central banks have known for 2-3 years that a crisis was coming. I mean, you know, if you ignore the mainstream media and you read some of their technical papers or you look at the internet, everyone knew something was going to happen. And so obviously there was coordination. I mean, there's been coordination at the BIS for a number of years and warnings about a crisis in the IMF, and former central bank officials and governors and chairman of the US Federal Reserve, they've all been warning that something was coming. And so there's been discussion about how to respond to this for quite a while, but obviously there was coordination during March, and obviously in the Four Corners show, I mean, generally the RBA is independent of the cabinet, but on this case there was even coordination between the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, and the RBA board on all decisions on fiscal and monetary. So there was coordination all around, and so I think that's a very fair point.
And of course, the implication of that, John, is that without that central bank intervention into the financial system, then the issues that we've been talking about for some time would have come home, and things like the derivatives would have blown up, and the liquidity amongst the banks would have blown up. And of course, most of the initiatives, if you actually look at it in terms of the relative quantums, most of the initiatives are to support the liquidity of the financial system.
Absolutely. So the other key question, just to follow on that, Martin. So the other key question that people need to ask themselves is, so one was the stimulus necessary, and was it the scale? So I argue no, and now we'll go into why shortly, because we said some very dramatic things back in 2018 on this particular point. But the other question that people need to ask themselves was, who was the beneficiary of the stimulus? And Martin, I'd like you to bring up a slide that I actually drew. I mean, having been a former management consultant, I like to draw pictures. And so this is a picture that's from my essay. And basically what I tried to capture is, well, where did all this stimulus go? And I've got a lot of boxes on the screen. And we've got the Australian economy on the left-hand side and the global economy on the right-hand side. And so basically what I can tell is, the stimulus went into 3 key sectors. One was directly into the banks. Another one was directly into domestic financial markets. And then obviously a lot of the fiscal stimulus went directly to households and to businesses. So when we say that the banks got bailed out in this process, so obviously the money that went straight into the banks, that was to give them liquidity, because there was foreign hedge funds that were selling government bonds quite dramatically, and even Christopher Joy was warning of a liquidity crisis in the banks. So that's how the banks got bailed out, number one. Now, the QE was designed to lower interest rates, so that the borrowing costs for banks wouldn't be elevated. So the QE, that was a direct intervention into the financial markets, and obviously with the Australian Office of Financial Management, which sells our bonds, with their $15 billion program, what would they be doing with that? They'd be buying mortgage-backed securities and asset-backed securities in order to ensure that there's no defaults, or there's no dramatic pricing in that sort of segment of the market that would cause issues with broader interest rates and other financial prices. And then on the issue of household stimulus and business stimulus. Now, why would they be giving households and businesses all this money? It's because they don't want households and businesses to default on their debts, because you have to think to yourself, well, without the stimulus, what would happen to households and businesses that would have defaulted on the debts, and our banks would have went under. and that's something that actually Christopher Joy, talked about in a recent podcast with Joseph Walker on the Jolly Swagman podcast, where Christopher said that that our big four banks would have gone had there not been any stimulus. So there are no doubt some of our viewers and a whole bunch of other Australians who are receiving these payments. And the question is, well, were the payments there to help individual businesses or households? Because that's the way the government presented it. So this was all about supporting households and businesses, or was it really there to bail out the banks? Because without them, the banks would have gone.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important question, and I think we can conclude that had there not been the flow of funds essentially into the banking system and into households, because basically households are getting 6 months holiday on their repayments, which means that they can sort of, the banks can then sort of say, well, that's fine, those loans are not gone bad. We also know that a number of businesses, of course, can now get help as well. And I just want to highlight, John, that the latest data that's coming out both from the ratings agencies and indeed from NAB today was that mortgage delinquencies were actually rising before this all happened.
Yeah. So it goes back to the old chestnut question between you and I, Martin: conspiracy or convenience. But the virus and the stimulus response came at the opportune time. And obviously, the other point to make is, Martin, is that given that we have a foreign debt, well, gross foreign debt is about 2.45 trillion, and a lot of that foreign debt is short-term foreign debt concentrated in the banks. So by helping the banks, our domestic banks, we're ensuring that we're not going to default on our foreign creditors, who are foreign banks, foreign hedge funds, foreign governments who have lent us nearly $2.5 trillion to basically live the lifestyle that we're living now, which is, in my view, quite unsustainable. So the question is that now a lot of people have said the government had no choice but to spend this money. And I think in the next show, I want to actually go through some of these comments that happened on Four Corners last week, where you had a number of personalities saying, well, there was no choice but to do the stimulus. And because the stimulus has basically trashed the dollar in terms of its purchasing power, versus gold, for example. But it's also created generational debt. So we've created a mountain of debt, which would take a whole generation to pay off if we're going to pay off it in some sort of normal fashion. And so a lot of the mainstream media, the parliamentarians, all of the establishment economists, they've all said we had no choice but to spend this money and to inflict this damage on 2 or 3 generations of Australians. Now, I reject that premise wholeheartedly. And so basically I say there was a choice. Now, you and I had a discussion about this 2 years ago. So we interviewed Sean Quinn, who's a mate of mine who was in Ireland between 2006 and 2008. So on that occasion, we talked about Anglo-Irish Bank, and Anglo-Irish Bank was bailed out by the Irish taxpayer. The ultimate beneficiary of that bailout was German banks who had lent Anglo-Irish Bank and the other Irish banks a lot of money to fund the housing bubble. And we asked Sean on that occasion, point blank, was the bailout worth it? And we also talked about what would our response be if the situation came here in Australia as to if we had to bail out our foreign creditors. So why don't we actually play that clip, Mark, because I think that's quite important.
Just before we come back to John.
Yep.
Question I've got is, was the blanket guarantee worth it?
I think the blanket guarantee wasn't worth it because I think at some levels the behaviours are already back. And I think, unfortunately, behavioural economics tells us that we really have to experience some pain somewhere along the line to reform our behaviour. I mean, I don't want to be overly theological about it, but that is essentially the behavioural economics viewpoint. I think we've lost a lot of high quality people out of the country. There has been a net immigration ever since. and you only have to walk around Sydney, Melbourne, or any part. You'll run across upper middle class Irish people all over the place. They're high level of professionals.
So basically, there was a long period of austerity, right?
Yep.
Following the settlement.
Yep.
Right. A long grind.
Yep.
But maybe fundamentally not much has changed, right? Because I'm
Very
seeing
little.
home prices rising again. I'm
Yep.
seeing debt rising again.
Yep.
And it's like history's almost getting to the point where you could
The big
say,
difference is the banks are much more reluctant to lend.
right? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
But again, that is relative.
Right. So basically, the route that was chosen, which was perhaps the least worst from some perspectives,
Yep.
has probably not solved much.
Not a great deal.
Right.
Not a great deal.
So, John, why is this relevant to Australia?
So why is it relevant is that, so obviously in previous episodes we've talked about household debt being at a record high in both nominal terms, but in terms of proportional disposable income. But we've also been talking about foreign debt. Now, we have about 486 billion in 90-day debt, and when you look at the amount of gross foreign debt, which has a maturity up to 1 year, we're talking about $750 billion. So most of that short-term debt is in the banks. So if we have a systemic crisis, if we have a shock coming from somewhere in the world, and basically people are struggling to make their mortgage repayments, and then one of the banks get into trouble, and I think we've talked about in terms of a previous episode about when we looked at the APRA stress test, we basically said that on the scenario that APRA modelled, according to your analysis, so remember the chairman of APRA said that the loss would be 40 billion. You said it would be in excess of 300 billion at a decline of 4% over 3 years in terms of GDP. Two banks out of the big four would be in trouble. And basically, I showed that scenario put forward by the chairman, the economic scenario was quite fallacious. So if one or more banks get into trouble, someone, if they default, if the big four go, who's going to take the loss? It's the foreign creditors. It's Washington, it's Wall Street, it's London, Switzerland, etc. So what happened in Ireland can very much well happen here. Prime Minister Morrison could get a phone call from an international creditor and basically say, you will bail out the big four, or we will cut you off. And if we do that, then the bailout money that has to come out, well, it's going to happen in one of two ways. So I think we've talked about this in previous episode. The amount of losses that the banks can take is about 650 billion when you look at bank reserves, the CLF, the Committed Liquidity Facility, and hybrid securities. So if they burn through 650 billion and there's still losses in excess of that, then this phone call is going to come. And then if the phone call comes, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer have a big choice to make to bail out the international creditors, because as like with Ireland, that's ultimately who's going to get the money, and then the taxpayer public debt is going to go ballistic in this country, or you basically say to the international cabal, we're not going to play ball. And if you do that, you're going to have a depression bigger than the 1890s. And we're looking at 30%, 35% unemployment. We're looking at house prices falling at 80%. We're looking at massive social cost in terms of suicide, in terms of divorce, in terms of domestic violence, drug abuse. I mean, these are real factors, real people. And so the question then becomes is, at that moment, what do you do? Now, Sean just said that 10 years on in Ireland, it wasn't worth bailing out the banks. And if I was Prime Minister at that moment, I would say, let's take the depression. Knowing the economic cost, knowing the social cost, and we are talking very significant social costs, but if you take a medium to long-term view, taking that hit, even though it's going to be horrific for a couple of years, is worth it. But I guess, yeah, and obviously, when we look at the live chat in terms of what we're saying on Tuesday, there was a number of DFA subscribers and followers who were saying Martin North should be our Prime Minister. So I guess the question for you now, so I've put my cards on the table, and you can't be more honest than this. Most politicians can't be, will not be willing to absorb the political cost, but also the social cost. I mean, because I think when I've spoken to certain people in Parliament, and we've gone through these scenarios, they have said the social cost is so significant that depression is for them is completely off the table. So they will bail out the banks, or they will go and have a Cyprus bail-in to prop up the banks because of what the social cost is. So the question for you, Martin, is that, knowing that people will die literally because suicides go up in depressions, knowing that domestic violence, so women will be bashed, children will go hungry, people go on drugs, crime will go up. In that moment, if you are Prime Minister, what would you do?
Oh, simple decision. I mean, it's tough, isn't it? Because you're thinking, I want to get elected next time, right? You're thinking, what's the least worst route in terms of short term, right? Mm. But you've also got to say, let's understand what created the problem in the first place, which is effectively the debt bomb, right? Let's understand that if we're simply just kicking the can down the road, we've actually not solved anything. We've just moved the problem out a bit, but we haven't actually fundamentally thought about how to reset the economy, right? And it seems to me that at some point, there has to be an Alt-Control-Delete on the way the economy works, right? So tough that would be. If I were getting that phone call, I'd go with you, John. I would say, I think that the short, sharp, deep recession, compression, whatever you want to call it, is probably the least worst option. Yeah, I remember that conversation well, and I think there were a few people who were quite surprised at our conclusion.
Yeah. So on that occasion, I said no bailout, no stimulus. We need to basically default. We need to have a depression. We need to have austerity, because the ultimate objective has to be to get rid of the debt. And this is something I think you and I have discussed in the past. Steve Keen has said that households need to reduce debt by 2/3, and some sort of default bankruptcy process. That is the most efficient way. So rather than compounding our economic problems, I would have still, in this situation. So one of the things I want to say to our audience, Martin, is that I've had a number of people on social media call out my morality and said that I have basically I'm evil, I'm satanic, I have no moral conscience because I would have basically had no support payments for households and businesses in this sort of situation. So a couple of points there. First one, I don't support the lockdown, still don't. I think we'll have another conversation about the decision to lock down, because there's more new information, new data that's come out since our last week's recording. But the other thing is that just like I said 2 years ago, is it's a decision of short-term costs versus long-term costs, and I would rather have a short-term hit, even if it is severe, in order to give our next one or two generations a prosperous life, rather than actually compound our problems today and subject our children and grandchildren to great economic misery.
Sure. And, I've always held the view that compounding a debt problem with ever more debt is not the most sensible strategy, because it's still got to be handled at some point in the future. We are continuing to mortgage the current generation into the future, and that means that future generations have to pick up the tab. So, John, I mean, it's worth, I think, asking then, in this scenario, what would your specific plan have been?
Sure. So yes. So what I think, looking at previous economic crises that have happened when you have a depression, I mean, how do you manage a depression well, and how do you quickly get out of it? So again, there's a very important story that I want to talk to the audience about in a future show that we'll do shortly. But because people say, well, if you don't do stimulus, what are you going to do? So I absolutely would have, I would have raised interest rates. Now, that seems very controversial, but the objective has to be is, if you're going to get rid of the debt as fast as you can. Yes, it will cause more pain, immediate pain. It's kind of like a Band-Aid. If you've got a Band-Aid, do you rip it off very quickly and it hurts a little bit? It stings, but then it quickly goes away, or do you slowly rip it off and cause more and more pain? So I would have had. We need to provide an incentive to save. We need to provide a disincentive to borrow. I would have reduced government spending. reduced taxes. I would have reformed the banks, so that we don't have too big to fail banks, and we have banks that are actually lending to productive businesses as opposed to lending to asset speculation. And I would have engaged in microeconomic reform on tax, on industrial relations, on energy policy, and a few other things that would have actually which would actually drive productivity and make it more internationally competitive. So by that sort of economic prescription, yes, we would have gone into a depression. It would have been severe. But let me give you an example. I mean, in 1932, Australia had 32% unemployment in the Great Depression, the second highest in the world behind Germany. But 4 years later, we had unemployment less than 10%, whereas in the US, they still had double-digit unemployment. So, there is historical evidence of having a depression, getting rid of debt, and turning the ship around quickly. So that is what I would have done, and this is obviously consistent with what I said 2 years ago. But I think it's fair to say, Martin, is that you've had a change of heart on stimulus.
Well, no, what I said, if it had been a pure financial crisis, in other words, if it was driven by essentially illiquidity amongst the banks, then I would agree with you, and I still think that you should actually bring that to bear to be able to shake out many, many years of bad behaviour and too much lending and all those things. My problem is that this was created initially by a health crisis, and I'm of the view that there was a requirement to spend specifically to deal with the health crisis, but I'm not sure that the amount of spending that has been ponied up nor its direction towards the financial system is the right way to actually go about it. So I would have done some, but I wouldn't have necessarily done what they have done.
So can you give our audience a bit of a sense? So when you say some, do you have a specific dollar measure, like a dollar amount? Do you have a specific prescription as to where the money would go?
Well, I think that probably about 10% of what they actually have ended up spending, I would have probably been comfortable to spend specifically on the health and the virus avoidance measures to because you got to get this virus out of the system one way or the other, right? And so that for me would be where I'd be focusing. I certainly wouldn't be propping up the banks.
Okay. All right. So the next part of what I want to talk about, Martin, now is the implications of the stimulus. So here's where I think the rubber is going to hit the road for a lot of Australians, including our viewers. So I think there's an immediate there's a conversation about the immediate term, and there's a conversation about the medium term. So the immediate term is I mean, I've heard in some of your DFA posts that you say you don't agree with a V-shaped recovery, and I would agree with that. So obviously it depends on how long the lockdown goes for, and how quickly we unlock the economy. But I think it's fair to say that for some people, including myself, I'm going to be going back to normal. My behaviour will not change at all once the economy unlocks. But I think for a lot of other people, they will be more hesitant about hopping on a plane or going to a restaurant or going to do or sitting in a cafe, etc. So I think there's going to be a whole host of we already know that there's a lot of small businesses already gone to the wall because of the lockdown, and I think it's fair to say that some other businesses will actually face more challenging times once the economy is unlocked because of changes in consumer behaviour. Because the other thing I think it's fair to say is as households are taking a huge hit to incomes, people will change their consumption decisions going forward, and I think there'll be a lot of people who will be reluctant to spend because they realise that they actually need to put money aside or recover their financial position that in terms of what they've just lost. And I think the other key point, Martin, is that for a lot of businesses, they have got support payments now. They have a reprieve from repaying back the banks on overdrafts or mortgages if they're small business, etc. So how we unlock in the transition, I think that's going to be extremely critical, because if you just say on one day, okay, everything goes back to normal, and you have to start repaying immediately your repayments, and you've got to pay your employees, I think for a lot of small business who are surviving at the moment, they won't be able to survive that sort of transition, because it'll take several months for them to reestablish profitability so that they can comfortably try to make all these repayments. So from a cash flow perspective, how that transition is managed is going to determine whether we have a second wave of business insolvencies and sustained unemployment or not.
Yeah, well, I think that's right, John. But I also make the point that the way that the programs have been put together, businesses are actually needing to borrow to pay their employees before they get money from the government. So there is a timing question, and we know that many lenders are still very slow to give businesses the funding that they need to be able to do that. So I'd also argue that the execution of JobKeeper is also creating further problems, and there are many small businesses who I think will never be able to recover from it.
Uh-huh. So okay, so that's the immediate term. Now my concern is so that's the immediate term. So my concern is more about the sort of the medium to long term. So Marta, what you and I have been discussing over the last couple of years is how we have trapped ourselves into a debt bubble, and we before the coronavirus we could never raise interest rates because the debt bubble would basically explode. And so we had a set of policy settings that basically locked us into a particular path. Well, because of the stimulus, we're even more trapped than we were before. So Westpac last week said that the cash rate is going to remain at 0.25 until 2023. So basically for the next nearly 2.5 years, 3 years, we're not going to actually see interest rates go up. In terms of quantitative easing, I mean, I've continually said once you start QE, you can never reverse it, because who's going to? I mean, you've bought bonds at elevated prices because there was insufficient private sector demand. So I mean, you can't, if you're going to sell them back into the market. I mean, who's going to buy them at the prices you bought? And so I suspect we're not going to see a shrinkage in the RBA's balance sheet, and I still think that we could even see further rounds of quantitative easing because as the debt bubble continues to grow, that they're going to get more and more desperate. Just like how the U.S. Federal Reserve, their balance sheet continues to grow because of the scale of the debt bubble. In terms of the federal and state governments, so there's been some discussion to say that we need to move immediately to tax reform and to industrial relations reform to drive economic growth so we can pay back in terms of this debt. If you don't, so I mean, first off is that's not going to generate enough economic growth to actually balance the budget, because the Americans have been talking about this for a long time. Even Trump said, well, if we generate more economic growth, we're going to have higher taxes, higher tax revenue, and then we're going to be able to balance the budget. Well, Trump's never been able to achieve that, and neither did Bush or Obama. So if you're going to balance the budget, you've got to cut spending. And what we know is that there's a lot of Australians who don't want government spending to be cut, because if you're going to cut government spending to balance the budget and start paying down this debt at a reasonable rate, you've got to make some very hard choices. So things like abolishing NDIS, raising the pension age, cutting back on Medicare, cutting back on education, doing things on unemployment insurance, because about 50 to 60% of the government's budget, the federal government's budget, is social welfare, health, and education. So if you're going to actually try to balance the budget and pay back this debt, you've got to make a whole bunch of decisions that a lot of people don't want to make. They don't want the government to make, and that's obviously one of the reasons why I was against the stimulus in the first place. Because if there's no prospect of paying back the debt, you shouldn't incur the debt in the first place. So where I think we're headed towards is stagflation. So what is stagflation? This is something we went through in the 1970s, which is low economic growth, elevated levels of unemployment, and elevated prices in terms of inflation, whether that inflation is recognised by the government or not through the CPI. And so when you have a depression, you do have high unemployment, but prices right across the economy, come down and they stay down. Whereas when you have stagflation, I mean, prices. Here's the thing: if your income has reduced, but prices are more expensive, whether it's land for real estate or food or utilities or whatever the basics is, I mean, middle class families get squeezed, and that's actually. That's a different type of Armageddon to having a depression, but that lasts for longer, because in the 1970s, stagflation happened. It went for more than 10 years.
Yeah, unfortunately, I remember that. I was there at the time, so I can remember what it was like when, in fact, we had very low productivity. We had cost of living rising, but incomes, not chasing it, and it's a really painful thing. And unfortunately, as you say, it's the middle class that gets squeezed.
Yeah. Trying to bring this conversation to a close, Martin, is if we don't have, ultimately we have to have austerity. We have to raise interest rates. We need to reduce this debt. We need to reform the economy. We need to cut back on government spending. We need to have balanced budgets and pay back even federal government debt as well as this private sector debt. Because if we don't, this debt bubble is going to continue to grow, and it's going to get out of control. And we're going to see, we're ultimately going to head towards one of three situations: a sovereign debt crisis that could lead to a debt restructuring or an outright default of government debt, and that could be at the state level or the federal level. We could have a balance of payments crisis. So if the dollar continues to, if our foreign creditors lose confidence in our ability to pay back the foreign debt, and this is something what we went through with Dr. Peter Brain last year, what you're going to see is the dollar fall, and then if we don't raise interest rates to defend the dollar, we could see runaway inflation and potentially hyperinflation. And again, some people, the MMT crowd and others, think that talking about hyperinflation in the Australian context is quite extreme because it's never happened before. But we're on the same sort of pathway that a whole host of countries who continue to print more and more money. We're on that sort of pathway. But the other thing is, I think we're going to start to see is greater tax confiscation and wealth confiscation as well. So superannuation. So I suspect going forward, because the federal government is going to be desperate for money, we're going to see further changes in super rules, because it's a $2 trillion pot, and I think for politicians who don't want to actually have a tough conversation with the Australian people about sacrifice, they're going to find ways to find easy money, and superannuation is one of the more obvious candidates. So for Martin, for people like yourself who are close to or for those who are in retirement, I think they will be reasonably spared. But I think in the next few years, particularly for people like me, who's I'm in my late 30s, we're going to start to see some clamping down of superannuation rules, which is going to basically undermine the system and actually undermine people's retirement and their ability to save for retirement.
Yes, and you'd suspect that the retirement age will go higher. You will suspect that the ability to save for retirement will be curtailed and incomes will be low. I suspect unemployment will also stay quite high as well, John. So, all those parameters suggest that the growth momentum that people aspire to is not going to come back very quickly. And that just means that the debt sits there lurking and getting more and more difficult.
Yeah. Like I said at the very beginning of the show, our economic problems have been compounded. We've got no net benefit out of the lockdown or the stimulus, in my view. Not only, like I said, not only do we have record household and foreign debt bubbles, but we now have governments drowning in debt, even further debt, particularly some of these state governments. And we have a dollar that basically. So let me just touch on this point, Martin. So in early March, the Australian dollar versus gold was $2,462 an ounce. Today it's $2,675 an ounce. So, gold, in the course of the last 2 months has gone up about $212 Australian, or it's gone up about 8.6%. So that's how much our purchasing power. So you think about, how do you measure the value of the Australian dollar? Well, you can measure it against the US dollar, but the US dollar has also fallen against gold. So all these fiat currencies that keep on printing and printing, they're all losing value against real assets. And the traditional way of measuring the purchasing power is gold. So, in the course of 2 months, the dollar's lost about 8.6% of purchasing power. And even the Bank of America last week said that they expect that gold in the next 18 months to go to $3,000 US an ounce. So if that were to happen, we will see further erosion of the purchasing power of the Australian dollar over the next 18 months.
So, yeah, and it's worth saying, I think the Bank of America is one of the most bullish on gold. There are other people who have rather different views, first point. Second point is, as all of the central banks around the world have been supporting their own economies through the same mechanism, other exchange rates like the US dollar, Aussie dollar, have actually been tracking quite close together. So we're at about 63. So it depends on how you measure the differential movement as to what the situation is. Gold is one way of doing it. It's by no means the only way of measuring it.
Sure. All right. Well, that's the gold bug in me.
Well, yeah. In a base position where you think that gold is effectively the cornerstone, absolutely right. There are other mechanisms that people use. I'm just making the point that you can argue it a couple of different ways. Sure.
So yeah. I mean, what else would I say is that the So basically, Australian policymakers are stuck. So we were stuck before, and now we're even more trapped in terms of our options of how to get out of the situation that we're now in. Without dramatic reform, I think we're headed towards stagflation, and middle class Australians are going to be even crushed, going forward. And basically, the economic future of Australia's children has been destroyed within a few weeks. And that's a trade-off that I never thought was reasonable. I didn't think it was reasonable in 2018. I don't think it's reasonable in 2020. And given that I've got two daughters, I'm extremely upset and concerned about what sort of future are my kids going to have in this country.
And I think it's worth saying, John, that a few people were suggesting that we should turn off the interest of the people because it's now happened, right? The event has happened. No, actually, the event may have started, but now it's the policy responses over the next little while that will determine the future of the country. And therefore, it's very important. It's actually ever more important that people making decisions in the interest of the people rather than just supporting the financial system and supporting the big debt.
Well, yes. So we were warning about a crisis because of the debt bubble, but the key point for our audience to understand is, well, the debt bubble hasn't gone. I mean, the debt bubble is still here.
Still there.
So because of what's happened in the last 4 to 6 weeks, I mean, these problems are going to compound, and the debt bubble is obviously growing around the world. So I think we are in an economic crisis now, but I think the economic crisis is going to get worse going forward. And so from my perspective, I think there's still a role to talk to Australians and educate them about the nature of the problem and what is the real pathway to prosperity, not the pathway that we're on today.
Yeah, thank you, John. Appreciate your time today, and we'll be back with more discussions very shortly. Martin North, John Adams. In the interest of people, we'll see you next time.